January 1944, skies over central Germany. The air is razor-thin at 25,000 feet. Frost blooms across the canopy of a B-17 Flying Fortress as it grinds eastward through freezing sunlight. Inside, 10 men breathe recycled fear and oxygen. Below them, the world is a quilt of snow and smoke. Above, nothing but contrails curving like ghosts across the heavens. Suddenly, the call crackles over the intercom. "Bandits high! 10 o'clock!" Black Crosses dive from the sun. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the pride of the Luftwaffe. Their cannons flare, streaking toward the bombers that have no place to hide. But then, something new cuts through the glare. A silver-grey shape with a low, humming snarl. Long-nosed, sleek, faster than anything the Germans have seen before. One pilot laughs over the radio. "Amerikanische Mustangs. They won't stay up here long." Seconds later, the laughter ends. The newcomer rolls, climbs effortlessly into the fight, and vanishes into a dive that outpaces even the Messerschmitt. That was the moment the Luftwaffe first realized. The skies over Europe had just changed. By 1943, the skies over Europe had become a battlefield suspended between worlds. Below lay cities turned to rubble. Above, the relentless thunder of engines that never seemed to rest. The Allies had committed to what they called the Combined Bomber Offensive, a promise to choke German industry until its armies could no longer fight. From dawn to dusk, waves of American B-17s and B-24s crossed the English Channel, their wings so dense they cast shadows on the fields of France. Their mission was simple in words, brutal in reality: strike the Reich's heart. But there was one fatal flaw. The bombers could only go as far as their escorts could protect them. The early American fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, were formidable, but they lacked the endurance for deep raids. Beyond the Rhine, bomber formations were forced to fly alone, heavy and slow, their defensive guns no match for the coordinated fury of the Luftwaffe. German pilots waited for them like wolves on the ridgeline. They called these missions Turkey Shoots. In the fall of 1943, entire bomber groups vanished over Schweinfurt, Regensburg and Bremen. Crews counted survival, not by mission success, but by the odds of making it home. Commanders at the 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe could read defeat in the empty bunks each morning. If something didn't change, daylight bombing, the cornerstone of American air power, would collapse. The answer, ironically, was already sitting unnoticed in a Californian workshop. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission had asked North American Aviation to build a new fighter for the Royal Air Force. The company's chief designer, Edgar Schmude, a German-born engineer who had once worked for Messerschmitt, offered to design something entirely new instead of copying an existing model. In just 117 days, his team delivered a prototype that looked unlike anything in the air. Long wings, a laminar flow airfoil, and a radiator scoop that doubled as an aerodynamic thrust amplifier. It was called the NA-73X, soon to be the Mustang. Early versions flew with an Allison engine, fast at low altitude but gasping for breath above 15,000 feet. The RAF used them mostly for reconnaissance and low-level attack, quick, rugged, but hardly revolutionary. Yet the airframe itself was a masterpiece waiting for the right heart. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Channel, the Luftwaffe still ruled. Pilots like Adolf Galland and Egon Meyer were national heroes, claiming dozens of kills. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109 G series and Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters were the most refined machines of their kind, compact, agile and deadly in experienced hands. Against the high-flying, lumbering bombers, they were near perfection. Still, cracks had begun to show. Allied radar and intelligence networks were tightening. Fuel reserves were shrinking. And for every German ace in the air, dozens of new Allied pilots were being trained each month. The Luftwaffe was still formidable, but its victories were becoming expensive. It could win battles, yet the war above Germany was beginning to tilt. The American leadership needed a miracle, something that could fly from England to Berlin, fight, and come back. Engineers called it range, pilots called it hope. In a quiet transfer of ideas that would change aviation history, British test teams mounted the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, the same one that powered the Spitfire Mk9, into the Mustang's fuselage. The result stunned everyone. Where the Allison-powered version struggled, the Merlin Mustang soared. It could climb with a Messerschmitt, dive with a Thunderbolt, and, most importantly, cruise for over 1,600 kilometers without auxiliary tanks. Suddenly, the concept of a true long-range escort was no longer theoretical. By the winter of 1943, production models were rolling out under a new name, the P-51B Mustang. Its polished fuselage and bubble canopy reflected the cold English sun as it joined the fighter groups of the 8th Air Force. For the first time, bomber crews had a guardian that could stay with them all the way to the target and all the way home, but the men flying over Germany didn't yet know it. The Luftwaffe still believed the Americans would never solve the range problem. They would soon discover how wrong they were. The revolution in the air had just begun. The transformation of the Mustang began not in an American hangar, but in a quiet British workshop. In the summer of 1942, engineers at Rolls-Royce fitted their new Merlin 61 engine into the Mustang airframe, and the effect was immediate. The sound alone was different, a deep, confident roar instead of the harsh snarl of the Allison. On the test strip at Boscombe Down, the modified fighter accelerated so fast that mechanics ran for cover. By the time it left the runway, the future of the air war had changed. At 30,000 feet, the Mustang was now faster than a Spitfire and nearly untouchable for any German interceptor. It could dive at 440 miles per hour without losing control and climb to altitude in less than 5 minutes. The British test pilots returned from each flight with the same astonished grin. This one can go to Berlin. Word reached Washington quickly. General Henry Hap Arnold of the U.S. Army Air Forces saw what others missed. The key to breaking Germany's air defenses was not more bombers, but better escorts. By late 1943, he ordered North American Aviation to produce the new model under U.S. designation P-51B and P-51C, powered by license-built Packard Merlin engines. Meanwhile, factories across the United States moved with wartime rhythm. Inglewood, Dallas, and Kansas City echoed with the hammering of aluminum skins and the whine of rivet guns. Each completed Mustang looked sleek and predatory, a symbol of industrial precision. The U.S. had finally found the perfect combination: British power, American range, and engineering that seemed born for the open sky. By November 1943, the first Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England. They were assigned to escort the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, missions deep into enemy territory where P-47s had always turned back. The bomber crews were skeptical. To them, this new fighter looked small, almost fragile compared to the rugged Thunderbolt. But once the first formation returned intact from a mission to Bremen, the tone changed. Crews began etching "Thank God for the P-51" on the noses of their aircraft. The Luftwaffe, however, remained unconcerned. German intelligence reports dismissed the Mustang as another American imitation of the Spitfire. Commanders believed that no U.S. aircraft could survive long at altitude against their veteran aces. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 and JG-2, the elite fighter wings guarding the Reich, viewed the new American plane as a curiosity, not a threat. But the reality was far deadlier. The P-51B carried 184 gallons of fuel internally, plus drop tanks that could add 150 gallons more. It could escort bombers all the way to the German capital and back, spending hours in the fight while Messerschmitts ran dry after mere minutes. And unlike earlier escorts that stayed close to bomber formations, the Mustang's agility allowed aggressive interception tactics, slashing attacks against interceptors before they reached the bombers. The psychological shift was enormous. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. German radio chatter from December 1943 reveals disbelief. They are still with the bombers, even over Kiel. Many Luftwaffe pilots thought they were seeing Spitfires, unaware that the same shape could now chase them hundreds of miles from England. Psychologists studying post-war accounts noted a dramatic shift in tone from Luftwaffe diaries between 1943 and 1944. The early entries brimmed with confidence, jokes about clumsy Americans, and pride in technical superiority. A year later, the same journals carried words like Erschöpfung, exhaustion, and Sinnlosigkeit, pointlessness. The pilots weren't merely losing the air war. They were losing belief in victory itself, even those who continued to score kills, like Erich Hartmann and Walter Nowotny, began describing the Mustang as an unstoppable tide. Hartmann, who ended the war with 352 victories, often refused combat when outnumbered, knowing that every engagement carried unbearable risk. The Mustang's presence forced him to change from hunter to survivor. This collapse of confidence rippled downward. Ground controllers hesitated to commit limited squadrons. Airfields shortened patrols to conserve fuel. Radar operators reported enemy formations and then prayed the Mustangs would not appear before the interceptors reached altitude. What began as technological dominance evolved into psychological warfare, and it worked without a single word of propaganda. Strategic angle shaping the fate of the war. By mid-1944, the Mustang was more than a fighter. It was the instrument through which Allied air strategy reached its full potential. Before its arrival, strategic bombing was an act of faith, sending unescorted bombers deep into enemy territory with the hope that sheer courage could overcome physics. With the Mustang, that faith became certainty. Now the bombers could go anywhere. Factories in Leipzig, oil refineries in Merseburg, aircraft plants in Augsburg, all once considered too deep for sustained raids, were now within reach. The Luftwaffe could no longer concentrate its forces at the front. Every base, every airfield, every fuel train was vulnerable. Allied planners called this deep air penetration. The Germans called it Die Luftblockade, the air blockade. Strategically, the results were devastating. Between February and May 1944, German aircraft production rose on paper, but collapsed in effectiveness. The factories were building planes faster than ever, yet there were no trained pilots or fuel to fly them. The Mustang had achieved what thousands of bombers alone could not. It removed the enemy's ability to fight back. And while the Luftwaffe struggled to defend its own skies, the Allies were preparing for something larger, Operation Overlord. The D-Day invasion would have been unthinkable without air superiority. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy that June, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. It could still inflict pain, but it could no longer change outcomes. When British and American officers briefed their troops for the invasion, one sentence stood out: "You will not see German planes over the beaches." That promise was kept by the men who flew the P-51 Mustang. From here, the narrative moves toward the storm, the moment when everything the Allies had built would be tested in combat during Big Week and the ensuing battles that shattered the Luftwaffe's spine. February 20th, 1944. Dawn over the North Sea. More than 1,000 Allied bombers formed up in the pale light, their wings glittering with frost. Below them, the silver escorts of the 8th and 15th Air Forces settled into position, P-47s, P-38s, and now, for the first time in full strength, the P-51 Mustangs. It was the beginning of Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week. The mission's goal was audacious: destroy Germany's aircraft production capacity once and for all. The targets were deep: Leipzig, Brunswick, Regensburg, Gotha and Schweinfurt, the industrial heart of the Reich's fighter program. For 5 days, the Allied armadas would hammer them relentlessly, daring the Luftwaffe to rise and fight, and the Luftwaffe did. From airfields across central Germany, the call went out: "Alarm start!" Engines roared, mechanics leapt clear, and lines of Bf-109s and FW-190s clawed into the sky. German radar stations tracked the vast Allied formation, their scopes glowing with blips so dense they looked like a storm front. Pilots strapped in with hands shaking, not from fear but exhaustion. Many were flying their third sortie in as many days. High above the clouds, the bomber streams advanced, slow, methodical, unwavering. Then came the contrails, weaving in from the east. The Luftwaffe was coming. Within minutes, the sky erupted into chaos, tracer fire, engine smoke, the shuddering flash of exploding bombers, and then the Mustangs arrived. Unlike earlier escorts that broke off over the frontier, the P-51s kept climbing, matching the German fighters mile for mile. In the first encounters, the Luftwaffe tried its usual tactic, diving head-on through the bomber boxes, then peeling away to regroup. But this time, as they broke off, the Mustangs followed. Their long-range engines didn't choke, their wings didn't stall. American pilots chased them down through the cloud layers, firing controlled bursts from 6 50-caliber Brownings that shredded aluminum and confidence alike. Within hours, the radio frequencies crackled with confusion. Achtung! Die neuen Begleiter! Sie bleiben noch hier! The new escorts. They're still here! The realization spread like wildfire across the Luftwaffe formations. The Americans had solved the range problem. There was nowhere left to hide. One German ace, Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, later recalled his first encounter. They came at us with such speed that I could not turn fast enough. I dived, and the Mustangs stayed behind me, not losing an inch. I had never seen anything like it. By the second day of Big Week, the Luftwaffe's interception system, once a masterpiece of timing, began to unravel. Commanders couldn't coordinate responses when Allied fighters were already overhead before takeoff. Mustang squadrons deliberately swept German airfields minutes before bomber waves arrived, forcing enemy planes to scramble into chaos. The Mustangs weren't invincible. They suffered losses too. Dozens never returned, their pilots last seen spiraling through the haze. But for every Mustang lost, 5 German fighters went down. The ratio was unsustainable. February 22nd brought the fiercest engagements of the week. Over Brunswick, a formation of Bf-109s dived on the bombers, only to be intercepted mid-attack by a pack of Mustangs led by Major James H. Howard. Alone, Howard broke formation and charged directly into 30 enemy aircraft, attacking a B-17 group. He fought for half an hour, shooting down 6 before limping home on a failing engine. The bomber crews, stunned, later reported, "He single-handedly saved us all." Howard became the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the Medal of Honor. That same day, deep over Regensburg, the Luftwaffe lost 100 aircraft, a number it could no longer afford. Every downed German pilot meant not just one man, but years of irreplaceable experience gone. The training schools couldn't keep up. The attrition that the Mustang had made possible was beginning to bite into the Luftwaffe's core. By the end of February 25, 1944, Big Week was over. In 6 days, the Allies had flown over 3,800 bomber sorties, dropped 10,000 tons of bombs, and destroyed or damaged nearly every major aircraft plant in Germany. The Luftwaffe claimed over 250 bombers, a bitter consolation for the 500 fighters it had lost. But the real casualty was control of the sky. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe could not dictate when or where it would fight. That power now belonged to the P-51 Mustang and the men who flew it. As the bomber streams turned home across a crimson sunset, the radio chatter fell quiet. Over Germany's smoking cities, the contrails drifted apart like fading scars. The outcome was not yet the end of the war, but it marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's irreversible fall, and in the weeks to come, that fall would accelerate, until even Germany's greatest aces were forced to admit defeat in the skies they once owned. After Big Week, nothing looked the same above Europe. The once formidable German fighter network that had blanketed the Reich now resembled scattered islands of resistance. Airfields lay cratered, fuel convoys burned along snow-covered roads, and repair shops overflowed with wrecks that would never fly again. The Luftwaffe tried to recover. Field Marshal Erhard Milch ordered emergency aircraft production to replace the hundreds lost. Goering promised new wonder fighters, the Me-262 jet, the Ta-152 high-altitude interceptor. But none of them could appear in the numbers or time required. Every flight test risked interception. Mustang patrols, operating from English bases and later forward airstrips in France, prowled from dawn to dusk. For German aces like Galland, Hartmann and Barkhorn, each sortie felt like gambling with fate. They were still dangerous, their marksmanship and instincts legendary, but they could no longer dictate combat. The P-51s could choose when to engage, climb higher, dive faster and withdraw at will. The initiative had shifted entirely to the Allies. Behind the front lines, Allied commanders were rewriting doctrine. General James Doolittle, newly appointed leader of the 8th Air Force, issued a bold new order. Fighter pilots were no longer bound to tight escort formations. Their mission was to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe in the air, wherever it appeared. The Mustang made that doctrine possible. Within weeks, the change rippled through every level of the campaign. P-51 groups began sweeping ahead of bomber formations, diving on Luftwaffe airfields and attacking interceptors as they took off. What began as defensive escort turned into offensive air supremacy. On the ground, the effect was devastating. Maintenance crews at German bases worked through nights illuminated by burning wrecks. Fuel shortages, already critical, became catastrophic. Every Mustang sortie forced the Luftwaffe to burn irreplaceable reserves. Every German pilot lost meant months of training gone forever. Still, the Luftwaffe fought with the ferocity of men who knew no retreat. Aces like Günter Rahl, Erich Hartmann, and Adolf Galland pushed their aircraft to the edge, sometimes diving so fast that their wings threatened to shear. But for every victory they scored, 10 new American fighters appeared over the horizon. By January 1944, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation, a battle not of numbers but of endurance. The question was no longer whether the Allies could reach Germany. It was whether the Luftwaffe could stop them once they did, and high above the clouds, the silver-winged Mustangs were already forming up for their first great test, a week that would later be remembered simply as Big Week. The technological angle. A machine ahead of its time, the P-51. Mustang wasn't just a fighter. It was a concept realized before its era. Where most wartime aircraft evolved from trial and error, the Mustang was born from design science, from numbers, airflow charts, and the precision of wind tunnel logic. Edgar Schmude and his team at North American Aviation built the airframe, around the laminar flow wing, a shape so smooth that even a layer of paint could disrupt its aerodynamic advantage. That wing gave the Mustang something every pilot craved: speed without sacrifice. At 30,000 feet, it could cruise faster than most fighters could dive. The deep belly radiator scoop wasn't just for cooling. It generated Meredith effect thrust, returning lost drag as extra speed. Every line of the aircraft spoke of efficiency. The long nose, the narrow fuselage, the perfect balance between lift and drag, all contributed to an elegance that was both mathematical and lethal. But perhaps the Mustang's most overlooked innovation was its range. Equipped with external fuel tanks, it could travel over 1,600 kilometers, allowing missions that spanned entire nations. Where the Spitfire was a short-distance duelist, the Mustang was a long-distance hunter. And that endurance would become the quiet weapon that strangled the Luftwaffe from the inside. The Packard-built Merlin engine, an American-produced version of the British Rolls-Royce masterpiece, completed the design's evolution. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger gave the P-51 consistent power at every altitude. Engineers had finally combined British aerodynamics, American production and global reach, even German engineers, when they later examined captured Mustangs, were forced to admit what their pilots had already discovered in the air, that no combination of Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf technology could match the Mustang's harmony of speed, climb, and range. The human angle, the view from the fortress for the men inside America's flying fortresses. The Mustang was not an aircraft, it was a promise. Before its arrival, every deep raid was a coin toss with death. In the high, thin air over Regensburg or Schweinfurt, bomber crews faced formations of German fighters swarming from all directions. When their escorts turned back over the Rhine, silence filled the intercoms. Each man knew what it meant. They were alone. But by late 1943, something began to change. Crews started seeing a glint of silver alongside them, deep over enemy territory. Wings swept, canopy gleaming, a sound that cut through the thunder of their engines. They called them Little Friends. Those friends stayed when no one else could. They circled crippled bombers, drove off attackers, and even escorted them all the way back across the Channel. For the first time, bomber crews could focus on their mission rather than counting how many gun positions still fired. In interviews recorded decades later, veterans recalled how morale shifted overnight. When the Mustangs came, one B-17 navigator said, "We knew we might actually live long enough to finish our tour." On the ground, pilots shared the same sense of awe and burden. Many were barely 20 years old, trained to fly an aircraft that could outpace anything in the world. The Mustang gave them speed, but not invulnerability. A single burst from a 20mm cannon could still tear a hole through its fuselage. The pilots flew not only for victory, but for the men they protected above the clouds. The tactical angle, changing the nature of the air war. The Mustang did more than escort bombers. It rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. Until its arrival, Allied escorts operated defensively, tied tightly to bomber formations, forbidden to chase the enemy too far. The Luftwaffe exploited this predictability, attacking from above, diving through the bombers, and retreating before escorts could react. But when the P-51 joined the fight, General Jimmy Doolittle changed everything. He issued a simple radical order. The first duty of the fighter is to destroy German fighters. No longer would American pilots wait for attacks. They would carry the battle to the Luftwaffe itself. The Mustang made this strategy possible. Its range allowed it to sweep hundreds of miles ahead of the bomber streams, hunting interceptors before they could climb into position. Mustang squadrons began prowling over German airfields, catching enemy fighters as they took off. Dogfights erupted not above bomber formations, but over Luftwaffe bases, where the advantage belonged entirely to the Allies. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, ordering dispersed takeoffs and hidden airstrips, but the Mustangs followed them relentlessly. By early 1944, German pilots began describing the skies as infested. A word once reserved for their own swarming formations. This change in doctrine, from passive defense to aggressive pursuit, broke the backbone of German air power. It forced the enemy to fight on terms they could not control. And as every battle consumed more of Germany's precious fuel and pilots, the Mustang's endurance ensured it would still be there long after its opponents had to turn for home. The tactical revolution had begun, but the psychological one was still to come. Because as the Mustangs dominated the skies, the German pilots, once the most feared in the world, began to feel something they hadn't known since 1939. Fear. And that fear would soon turn into collapse. The enemy perspective. Laughter turns to realization. At first, the Luftwaffe laughed. Reports of an American Spitfire reaching Berlin were met with disbelief at German fighter command. Veteran aces dismissed it as propaganda, another boast from the amateur flyers of the United States Army Air Forces. But then the losses began to mount. At first, they were subtle. A flight of Bf-109s would climb toward a bomber stream and never return. A Focke-Wulf patrol sent to intercept would vanish into the clouds. their radio calls ending abruptly mid-transmission. When survivors did return, their faces told the truth before their words did. It's not the old escort anymore. For the first time since 1940, German pilots faced an opponent that could fight them on equal terms and stay there. The P-51B's high-altitude stability and blistering dive speed erased the Luftwaffe's tactical comfort zone. Where the Messerschmitt could once dive away from pursuit, now the Mustang followed, closing the gap with calm inevitability. Luftwaffe aces, who had once toyed with American fighters, found themselves outmaneuvered by young pilots with no fear and no reason to turn back early. Adolf Galland, the famed commander of Germany's fighter forces, later admitted, "When the Mustangs appeared, it was no longer our war to win, only to delay." The psychological blow was immense. The very name Mustang began spreading through Luftwaffe squadrons like a rumor-turned-nightmare. It was the aircraft they could never quite shake, the one that appeared out of the sun, followed them into the dive, and returned again the next day. The psychological angle, the shattering of the Luftwaffe. No machine can win a war alone, but morale can lose one. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was suffering not just material losses, but a spiritual collapse. Pilots once celebrated as national heroes now faced impossible odds, outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly outtrained. Every new sortie meant another round of attrition they could not afford. Fuel shortages limited flight hours to a fraction of Allied training schedules. New recruits arrived with barely 100 hours in the air, thrown directly into combat against veterans flying Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Those who survived their first week often described the same haunting experience, the constant shadow of silver wings above them. For bomber crews, the Mustang was hope. For German pilots, it became inevitability. No matter the maneuver, the altitude, or the weather, the enemy was there. They began calling them Langstreckenjäger, long-range hunters, and the name fit perfectly. By March 1944, the new doctrine of offensive escort was in full swing. Mustang squadrons began attacking Luftwaffe formations before they reached bomber corridors, ambushing them at rendezvous points identified by Allied codebreakers. The German command chain, stretched and panicked, often ordered multiple wings into the same airspace, creating confusion that the Mustangs exploited mercilessly. Radio discipline disintegrated. Veteran pilots shouted contradictory orders, while newcomers broke formation in fear. The result was catastrophic attrition. On March 6, during the first full daylight raid on Berlin, 69 Luftwaffe fighters were shot down for the loss of 11 Mustangs. German civilians in the capital watched dogfights unfolding above their rooftops, black crosses spiraling down in flames while silver wings climbed into the sun. The propaganda ministry forbade newsreels of these scenes. Goering raged in private. "If one American bomber reaches Berlin, you may call me Meyer." That day, hundreds did. In the weeks that followed, the Luftwaffe's command structure unraveled. Replacement pilots barely trained beyond takeoff procedures were thrown into combat. The once disciplined defensive grid that had protected Germany since 1940 dissolved into isolated skirmishes. Intelligence summaries from March and April tell a grim story. Interception rates fell by half. Operational aircraft availability dropped below 40%. And fuel stockpiles dwindled to a few days' supply. Meanwhile, the Mustangs pressed their advantage. Pilots from the 4th Fighter Group and the 357th Group earned reputations as relentless hunters. They strafed enemy airfields, trains, and convoys with precision that paralyzed German logistics. Every destroyed transport or locomotive meant less fuel for the fighters that remained. The skies of Germany became not a battlefield, but an execution ground. On April 24, 1944, Allied intelligence estimated that the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,500 fighters in just 8 weeks, a rate of loss it could never sustain. The air war's momentum had passed a point of no return. The Mustang's endurance made strategic bombing viable again, and that air dominance opened the door for the next phase of Allied planning, the invasion of Western Europe. From April to June, the P-51's presence grew overwhelming. Units rotated between deep escort missions and low-level sweeps, ensuring there was almost no hour when German pilots could train or regroup. Even the once safe southern skies over Austria and Hungary were filled with the sound of Packard Merlins. Allied commanders could now direct bomber raids without fear of catastrophic losses. By the time the Normandy landings approached, the Luftwaffe faced an impossible equation. To defend France, it would have to pull fighters from Germany's industrial defense, but that would expose the homeland. To stay over Germany meant surrendering the coast. Whichever it chose, the Mustang would meet it there first. The P-51 became a symbol of inevitability. Its silhouette, long fuselage, bubble canopy and perfect symmetry haunted German spotters. It was the machine that followed the bombers to Berlin, that loitered above every airfield, that always seemed to have more fuel, more speed, more time. Its pilots wrote call signs like the Hun Hunter from Texas and Old Crow on their noses, confident that by war's end they would still be alive to repaint them. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe barely appeared. A few dozen FW-190s made half-hearted passes at the invasion fleet and were immediately driven off. German ground troops looked up and saw only Allied markings. That absence, that silence of the Luftwaffe, was the loudest testimony to what the P-51 had accomplished. Even Adolf Galland, once the proud architect of the Luftwaffe's fighter strategy, later admitted with weary respect the P-51 was the finest all-around fighter of the war. It arrived in time to save the American bomber offensive and to finish us. By summer's end, the Mustang was no longer just an escort. It was the dominant predator of the European sky, a machine that had taken the Luftwaffe's greatest strength and turned it into its greatest weakness. From this point, the world below would change as quickly as the air above. Cities burned, fuel lines collapsed, and the Reich's once unbreakable wall of defense vanished beneath an endless tide of contrails. Next, we trace what followed, the consequences, the numbers, the legacy. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe belonged to the Allies. What began as a desperate gamble, daylight bombing without true protection, had transformed into an unstoppable machine of precision and endurance. The P-51 Mustang had done what no other fighter had managed. It changed the balance of power in the air so completely that even before the Allied invasion began, Germany had already lost the air war. The statistics tell part of the story. Between February and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 5,000 aircraft in combat. Most were shot down not by bombers, but by escort fighters. Overwhelmingly P-51s. Each destroyed German plane was more than metal. It was a pilot, a teacher, a reservoir of experience that the Reich could no longer replace. The once elite fighter schools of the Luftwaffe, which had trained aces like Galland and Hartmann, now rushed recruits through courses in mere weeks. Some cadets went into combat with fewer than 10 flight hours in a frontline aircraft. In contrast, the Allies were producing Mustangs faster than they could assign pilots to them. American industry had reached its wartime rhythm. Factories in Inglewood, Dallas, and Kansas City turning out hundreds each month, everyone identical, everyone ready to fly. The Packard Merlin engines arrived by train in endless rows of crates. The logistical machine that had once seemed America's distant advantage was now a thunderous reality. Operationally, the Mustang's reach made every corner of Germany vulnerable. No target was too far, no airfield too remote. From bases in England, Italy, and later from captured French strips, the Silver Fighters ranged deep across the continent. They swept over the Reich's industrial heartlands, strafing fuel depots, rail yards, and transport convoys. They escorted bombers to targets like Leipzig, Hamburg, and Dresden, and then circled back to attack retreating fighters trying to land. The effect on the German war economy was catastrophic. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pollitz were struck repeatedly until their output fell by 90%. Without fuel, tanks could not move, trucks could not resupply, and aircraft could not train. The Mustang's contribution was not measured only in dogfights won, but in hours of fuel denied to the enemy. By mid-1944, German pilots were flying barely 1/10 of the training hours their American counterparts logged. Young men climbed into cockpits, looked across the horizon, and saw it filled with contrails they could not escape. Even the most hardened aces began to acknowledge defeat in private. A captured German officer later said, "We did not fear the bomber formations. We feared the ones that came with them." On the ground, Allied commanders recognized that air supremacy had become their most powerful weapon. In the weeks before D-Day, the Mustang's mission shifted again. No longer limited to escort duties, they now scoured France's countryside, blasting bridges, trucks, and communication lines. By the time the first Allied troops landed on June 6th, the German army was nearly blind. Its columns could not move by day without risking annihilation from the air. When the landings began, the Luftwaffe's presence over Normandy was almost invisible. Only a handful of fighters managed to reach the beaches, and most were quickly driven off or destroyed. The few German soldiers who looked up saw a sky filled entirely with Allied markings, P-51s, P-47s, Spitfires, and Typhoons, circling like hawks over the sea of invasion craft below. The Mustang had done more than win battles. It had enabled the Allies to wage war on their own terms, to invade, to maneuver, and to strike with impunity. From that moment onward, Germany would never again control its own airspace. The cost had been immense. Thousands of American and British airmen lost, countless machines burned out over enemy territory. But the result was unmistakable. The Mustang had turned the air war from a defensive struggle into an offensive triumph, and as 1944 turned toward its summer of invasion and liberation, even the most optimistic German reports admitted a grim truth. The enemy dominates the skies over the fatherland. As the Allies advanced across France and into Germany, the P-51 Mustang remained ever present, the silent spearhead of air superiority. Its pilots, once tasked only with defending bombers, now became hunters of opportunity. They roamed ahead of advancing ground forces, striking trains, convoys, and retreating columns. With long-range tanks slung beneath their wings, they followed Patton's Third Army across France and Eisenhower's great push toward the Rhine. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe existed mostly on paper. Its remaining aircraft were hidden in forests and barns, dispersed to avoid annihilation on the ground. Yet even concealment offered no safety. The Mustang's range allowed daily patrols that reached deep into Bavaria, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Squadrons swept over these regions with ruthless regularity: seek, engage, destroy. In the winter of 1944-45, the Germans launched one final gamble, Operation Bodenplatte, a massive low-level assault meant to cripple Allied air power on New Year's Day. Hundreds of FW-190s and Bf-109s roared across the front, catching many airfields by surprise. For a few hours, the plan seemed to work. Rows of Allied aircraft burned on the ground. But by the next afternoon, the Mustangs were airborne again. They hunted the attackers as they returned to their bases, shooting down more than 300 in a single day. The Luftwaffe lost its last reserves of trained pilots in those hours. What had begun as a daring strike ended as a suicide mission. By April 1945, German air resistance had virtually ceased. The few jets that entered service, the revolutionary Me-262s, were too few, too late, and too vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Even these technological marvels fell victim to the same relentless pattern: Mustang pilots circling above, waiting to strike when their prey was weakest. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the numbers told a story beyond imagination. The U.S. Army Air Forces had destroyed more than 40,000 German aircraft, and the Mustang had played a decisive role in that tally. The P-51 accounted for nearly half of all aerial victories by American fighters in the European theater. Yet its legacy extended beyond numbers. The Mustang had changed what air power meant. No longer was air combat defined by short-range dogfights or defensive patrols. Range, endurance, and coordination had become the pillars of modern air strategy. Every post-war jet fighter, from the F-86 Sabre to the MiG-15, owed part of its design philosophy to lessons learned from the Mustang. For the men who flew it, the bond ran deeper than technology. Many described the P-51 as a living thing, an aircraft that thought with you. It could roll at will, climb like a hawk, and recover from dives that would have destroyed heavier planes. Veterans recalled the way the control stick felt, alive in their hands, transmitting every vibration of the engine, every ripple of air. It became not just a weapon, but a companion, one that carried them through fear, fatigue, and victory. After the war, the Mustang refused to fade. It served in the newly formed U.S. Air Force and fought again in Korea, strafing ground targets, long after jets had taken over the skies. It flew reconnaissance, counterinsurgency, and even racing circuits. In nations across the world, from Sweden to Israel to the Philippines, the P-51 became a symbol of freedom, endurance, and mechanical perfection. For the Germans who once fought against it, there was a quiet respect. In post-war interviews, former Luftwaffe pilots rarely spoke with bitterness. Instead, they spoke of admiration. One ace called it a gentleman's aircraft, beautiful, deadly, and fair. It was an acknowledgement that even in defeat, there can be grace in recognizing mastery. By the late 1940s, the era of the propeller was ending, but the Mustang's silhouette still commanded reverence. Museums and air shows would later display its long wings and polished fuselage as reminders of a time when the fate of nations depended on the courage of young men and the power of their machines. And through it all, one truth endured: the P-51. Mustang had done more than win a war. It had redefined what victory in the air looked like. It proved that engineering, courage, and endurance could overcome even the most disciplined enemy. The skies over Europe were silent now, but for those who had once looked up and seen the silver wings glinting in the sun, that silence carried the echo of a single sound, the deep, confident growl of a Merlin engine fading into history. War is often remembered for its brutality. The bombings, the losses, the wreckage left behind. But sometimes, history's truest legacy lies not in destruction, but in transformation. The P-51 Mustang was born from desperation, refined by collaboration, and perfected by necessity. It bridged nations, American design, British engineering, global hope, into a single machine that changed the rhythm of the war. In the cold skies over Europe, where breath froze inside oxygen masks and life was measured in minutes of combat, the Mustang gave men something they hadn't known in years: confidence. It turned fear into focus, retreat into pursuit. It made the impossible, daylight raids deep into the heart of Germany, not just survivable, but winnable. Yet beyond the battles and victories, its story speaks to something greater: the evolution of human mastery over flight itself. The Mustang represented the moment when technology and instinct found perfect balance. It didn't dominate through brute power or overwhelming size, but through precision, through harmony. For the German aces who once laughed at its arrival, the Mustang became a lesson in humility. For the Allied pilots who flew it, it became a lesson in trust. Trust in design, in teamwork, in endurance. And for the generations that came after, it became a symbol of what vision and determination can achieve when the stakes are survival itself. Even today, when its polished wings catch the sunlight at air shows, veterans still pause to listen. That sound, the deep hum of the Merlin engine, is more than nostalgia. It is the voice of a time when courage and innovation met above the clouds, and humanity learned that dominance in war need not come from arrogance, but from relentless pursuit of excellence. The P-51 Mustang didn't just outrun the Messerschmitts, it outlasted them, in memory, in legacy, and in the eternal blue quiet it left behind. Love WW2 stories? Hit subscribe. More real history is on the way.